Dear friends, let's begin with part 2 of The Derelict, written by William Hope Hodgson. Hey, have you got over there, Furad? Asked Captain Gunnington. Yes, sir, said the bowman. As he spoke, there came a queer noise of tearing. What's that? Asked the captain. It's tore, sir. Tore clean away, said the man, and his tone showed that he had received something of a shock. Get a hold again then, said Captain Gunnington irritably. You don't see those packet? Those packet was built yesterday? Shove the hook into the main chains. The man did so gingerly, as you might say, for it seemed to me in the growing dusk that he put no strain onto the hook, though, of course, there was no need. You see, the boat could not go very far of herself in the stuff in which she was embedded. I remember thinking this also as I looked up at the bulging side of the old vessel. Then I heard Captain Ganningston's voice. Lord, but she's old. And what a color, doctor. She don't half want paint, do she? Now then, somebody, one of them oars. An oar was passed to him, and he leant it up against the ancient bulging side. Then he paused and called to the second mate to light off a couple of the lamps and stand by to pass them, for darkness had settled down upon the sea. The second mate lit two of the lamps and told one of them to light a third one and keep it handy in the boat. When he stepped across with a lamp in each hand to where Captain Gunnington stood by the oar against the side of the ship. Now, my lad, said the captain to the man who had pulled up stroke, up with you, and we'll pass up the lamp. The man jumped to obey, caught the oar, and put his weight upon it, and so he did. Something seemed to have a little. Looked, cried out the second mate, and pointed lamp in hand. It sunk in. This was true. The oar had made quite an indentation in the bulging, somewhat slimy of the vessel. Mould, I reckon, said Captain Gunnington, bending towards the derelict to look. Then to the man, up you go, my lad, and be smart. Don't stand there waiting. At that, the man who had paused a moment as he felt the oar give beneath his weight began to shin up, and in a few seconds he was aboard, and leant out over the rail for the lamps. These were passed up to him, and the captain called to him to steady the oar. Then Captain Gunnington went, calling to me to follow, and after me the second mate. As the captain put his face over the rail, he gave a cry of astonishment. Mould, by gum, mould! Tons of it, good Lord! As I heard him shout, I scrambled the more eagerly after him, and in a moment or two I was able to see what he meant. Everywhere that the light from the two lamps struck, there was nothing but smooth great masses and surface of a dirty white mold. I climbed over the rail with the second mate close behind and stood upon the mold-covered decks. There might have been no planking beneath the mold for all that our feet could feel. It gave under our tread with a spongy budding feeling. It covered the deck furniture of the old ship so that the shape of each article and fitment was often no more than suggested through it. Captain Gunnington snatched a lamp from the other man. The second mate reached for the other. They held the lamps high, and we were all stared. It was most extraordinary and somehow most abominable. I can think of no other word, gentlemen, that he was so much describes the predominant feeling that affected me at the moment. Good Lord, said Captain Gunnington. Several times, good Lord. But neither the second mate nor the man said anything, and for my part, I just stared and at the same time began to smell a little of the air, for there was a vague odor of something half familiar that somehow brought me to a sense of half no fright. I turned this way and that, starting as I have said. Here and there, the mold was so heavy as to entirely disguise what lay beneath, coverting the deck, fitting into indistinguishable molds of mold, all dirty white and blotched, veined with irregular dull purplish markings. There was a strange thing about the mold which Captain Gunnington drew attention to. It was that our feet did not crush into it and break the surface, as might have been expected, but merely intended to. Never seen nothing like it before. Never, said the captain, after having stooped with his lamp to examine the mold under our feet. He stamped with his heel, and the mold gave out a dull pudding sound. He stopped again with a quick movement and stared, holding the lamp close to the deck. Blessed if it ain't a regular skin to it, he said. The second mate and the man and I all stooped and looked at it. The second mate probed it with his forefinger, and I remember I rapped it several times with my knuckles, listening to the dead sound it gave out, and noticing the close, firm texture of the mold. Dough, said the second mate. It's just like a blessed dough. Puff! He stood up with a quick movement. I could fancy it stinks a bit, he said. As he said this, I knew suddenly what the familiar thing was. In the vague odor hung about us, it was that the smell had something animal like in it. Something of the same smell, only heavier, that you will smell in any place that is infested with mice. I began to look about with a sudden, very real uneasiness. There might be vast numbers of hungry rats on board. They might prove exceedingly dangerous if in a starving condition, yet, as you will understand, somehow I hesitated to put forward my idea as a reason for caution. It was too fanciful. Captain Gannington had begun to go aft along the mold covered main deck with the second mate, each of them holding its lamp high up so as to cast a good light about the vessel. I turned quickly and followed them, the man with me keeping close to my heels and plainly uneasy. As we went, I became aware that there was a feeling of moisture in the air, and I remembered the slight mist or smoke above the hulk which had made Captain Gannington suggest spontaneous combustion in explanation. And always, as we went, there was a vague animal smell, and suddenly I found myself wishing we were all away from the old vessel. Abruptly, after a few paces, the captain stopped and pointed at a row of the mold hidden shapes on each side of the main deck. Guns, he said. Guns been a privateer in the old days. I guess, maybe worse. We'll have a look below, Doctor. There may be something worth touching. She's older than I thought. Mr. Selvern think she's about 300 years old, but I scarce think it. We continued our way aft, and I remember that I found myself walking as lightly and gingerly as possible, as if I were subconsciously afraid of treading through the rotten mold hid decks. I think the other had a touch of the same feeling from the way that they walked. Occasionally, the soft mold would grip our heels, releasing them with a little sullen suck. The captain forged somewhat ahead of the second mate, and I know that the suggestion he had made himself that perhaps there might be something below worth carrying away had stimulated his imagination. The second mate was, however, beginning to feel somewhat the same way that I did. At least, I have that impression. I think if it had not been for what I might truly describe as Captain Gannington's sturdy courage, we should all of us have just gone back over the side very soon. For there was most certainly an unwholesome feeling abroad that made one feel queerly lacking in pluck, and you will soon perceive that this feeling was justified. Just as the captain reached the few mold covered steps leading upon the short half poop, I was suddenly aware that the feelings of moisture in the air had grown very much more definite. It was perceptible now, intermittently, as a sort of thin, moist, fog like vapor that came and went oddly and seemed to make the decks a little indistinct to the view this time. Once, an odd puff of it beat up suddenly from somewhere and caught me in the face, carrying a queer, sickly heavy about with it that somehow frightened me strangely, with the suggestion of waiting and a half comprehended danger. We had followed Captain Gannington up to the three mold covered steps and now went slowly aft along the raised after deck. By the mizzen mast, Captain Gannington paused and held his lantern near to it. My word, mister, he said to the second mate, it's fair thickened up with the mold. Why, I'll guarantee it's close on 4 foot thick. He shone the light down to where it met the deck. Good Lord, he said. Look at the sea lice on it. I stepped up, and it was as he said. The sea lice were thick upon it, some of them huge, not less than the size of large beetles, and all a clear, colorless shade like water, except where there are little spots of grey in them. Evidently, they are internal organisms. I've never seen like them except on a live cod, said Captain Gannington in an extremely puzzled voice. My word, but they're whoopers. Then he passed on, but a few paces farther he stopped again and held his lamp near the mold hidden deck. Lord bless me, doctor, he called out in a low voice. Did you ever see the like of that? Why, it's foot long, if it's a inch. I stooped over his shoulder and saw what he meant. It was a clear, colorless creature about a foot long and about 8 inches high, with a curved back that was extraordinarily narrow. As we stared, all in a group, it gave a queer little flick and was gone. Jumped, said the captain. Well, if that ain't a giant of all the sea lice that I have ever seen, I guess it's jumped 20 foot clear. He straightened his back and scratched his head a moment, swinging the lantern this way and that way, the other hand and staring us. What are they doing aboard? He said. You'll see 'em on Fat Cod and such like. I am blowed, doctor, if I understand. He held his lamp towards a big mound of the mold that occupied part of the after portion of the low poop deck, a little foresight of where there came a 2 foot high break to a kind of second and loftier poop that ran away aft to the traffic trail. The mound was busy, pretty big, several feet across and more than a yard high. Captain Gannington walked up to it. I reckon this is the scuttle, he remarked, gave it a heavy kick. The only result was a deep indentation into the huge whitish hump of mold, as if he had driven his foot into a mass of some doughy substance. Yet, I am not altogether correct in saying that this was the only result, for a certain other thing happened. From a place made by the captain's foot, there came a little gush of purplish fluid accompanied by a peculiar smell that was and was not half familiar. Some of the mold like substance had stuck to the toe of captain's boot, and from this likewise there issued a sweat, as it were the sum of colour. Well, said Captain Gunnington in surprise, and drew back his foot to make another kick at the hump of mold. But he paused at an exclamation from the second mate. Don't, sir, don't, said the second mate. I glanced at him, and the light from Captain Gunnington's lamp showed me that his face had a bewildered, half frightened look, as if it was suddenly and unexpectedly half afraid of something, and as if his tongue had given way to his sudden fright, without any intention on his part to speak. The captain also turned and stared to him. Why, mister? He asked, in a somewhat puzzled voice, through which there sounded just the vaguest hint of annoyance. We've got to shift this muck if we are to get below. I looked at the second mate, and it seemed to me that curiously enough he was listening less to the captain than to some other sound. Suddenly he said, in a queer voice, Listen, everybody. Yet we heard nothing beyond the faint murmur of the men talking together in the boat alongside. I don't hear anything, said Captain Gannington after a short pause. Do you, doctor? No, I said. What was it you thought you heard? Asked the captain, turning again to the second mate. But the second mate shook his head in a curious, almost irritable way, as if the captain's question interrupted his listening. Captain Gannington stared a moment at him, then held his lantern up and glanced about him, almost uneasily. I know I felt a queer sense of strain, but the light showed nothing beyond the greyish dirty white of the mould in all directions. Mr. Selvern, said the captain, at last looking at him, don't get fancy things. Get hold of your blooming self. You know, you heard nothing. I'm quite sure I heard something, sir, said the second mate. I seemed to hear. He broke off sharply and appeared to listen with an almost painful intensity. What did it sound like? I asked. It's all right, doctor, said Captain Gannington, laughing gently. You can give him a tonic when we get back. I'm going to shift this stuff. He drew back and kicked for the second time at the ugly mass, which he took to hide the companionway. The result of his kick was startling, for the whole thing wobbled sloppily like a moon of unhealthy looking jelly. He drew his foot out of it quickly and took a step backwards, staring and holding his lamp towards it. By gum, he said, and it was plain that he was generally startled, the blessed things gone soft. The man had run back several steps from the suddenly flagged mount and looking horribly frightened, though of what I am sure he had not the least idea. The second mate stood there where he was and stared. For my part, I know I had the most hideous uneasiness upon me. The captain continued to hold his light towards the wobbling mound and stare. It's gone squashy all through, he said. There's no scuttle there. There's no bally woodwork inside the lot. What a rum smell. He walked round to the after side of the strange mound to see whether there might be some signs of an opening into the hull at the back of the great heap of mould stuff, and then listen, said the second mate again in the strangest sort of voice. Captain Gannington straightened himself upright, and there succeeded a pause of the most intense quietness, in which there was not even a hum of talk from the men alongside in the boat. We all heard it, a kind of dull, soft thud, 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 somewhere in the hull under us, yet so vague that I might have been half doubtful I heard it, only that the others did so. Captain Gannington suddenly turned to where the man stood. Tell them, he began. But the fellow cried out something and pointed. There had come a strange intensity into his somewhat unemotional face, so that the captain's glance followed his action instantly. I stared, also, as you may think. It was a great mound to which the man was pointing. I saw what he meant. From the two gaps made in the mold-like stuff by Captain Gannington's boot, the purple fluid was jetting out in a queerly regular fashion, almost as if it were being forced out by a pump. My word, but I stared, and even as I stared, a larger jet squirted out and splashed as far as the man, spattering his boots and trouser legs. The fellow had been pretty nervous before in a stolid, ignorant sort of way, and his funk had been growing steadily. But at this he simply let out a yell and turned about to run. He paused an instant as if a sudden fear of the darkness that held the decks between him and the boat had taken him. He snatched at second mate's lantern, tore it out his hand, and plunged heavily away from the wild stretch of mold. Dear friends, this is the end of part 2. Stay tuned to know what happened to Captain Gannington and his mates on the boat when the heavy bodily plunged on them.